So in this mini-series, we are going to talk about things that we should consider when choosing our next racket. If you've been following this channel, you'll know that I have gone through the recent process of selecting my new racket, and I will reveal that in due time. But there are about 5 things that you need to consider, maybe even more, when it comes to your choice of racket. At the end of the day, it's a personal choice, but I'm just going to go explain and go through a few factors that need to be considered before we make that big choice. Without further ado, let's get into this topic. So the first thing to talk about is your racket shape. There are 3 types of racket shapes that you need to consider. Let's start with the first one. So this is probably what you would see in many old pictures and many old squash videos with rackets, and this is what we call the traditional squash racket. Some people call it a closed throat racket as well, but this is your stock standard traditional racket that has been in existence from, I guess, when squash was invented. The main characteristic of this type of racket is the fact that it has a shorter main string, which goes from the top to the bottom. The shorter main string means that you'll have a much smaller sweet spot compared to the other types of rackets that we're going to speak about. The smaller sweet spot means that it is more of a control type racket. Although the sweet spot might be smaller, hitting it in that correct sweet spot results in a higher accuracy of where the ball goes. Although we have the pro of a smaller sweet spot and a racket that provides higher accuracy for your shots, we do have the con that when you do not hit the sweet spot, the ball tends to deviate quite badly from the path in which you have directed it to. Not that this racket cannot be used by a lot of people. In fact, it's actually a brilliant type of racket to maybe begin with and to start in terms of getting your accuracy correct. But what would happen is that this shape not being so forgiving. So with the traditional shape racket, what it means is that your shots might be less forgiving and you're prone to maybe make a lot more errors, and you might feel a bit under pressure to sort of control the tee. So normally this type of racket is used by someone who's got very good fundamentals, great technique, and isn't really prone to making as many mistakes. They've got their timing correct, their racket preparation is very good. Someone that I can use as an example for it is Gary Whedon, a South African squash legend, and I even asked him questions if he actually got taught to hold his racket that way, but I think it's part of his preparation, and he's obviously used this style of racket for many years. So contrary to popular belief, the sweet spot isn't exactly in the middle of the racket, it is slightly to the top end of a racket, and I think if you can really see it on here with this racket that I have used, where it starts to fiber, that is where your sweet spot would be, just a bit around this sort of area. So not really halfway per se, just a bit further up there, around 2/3 up from the bottom of the racket. Sweet spots can deviate depending on how your squash racket is strung. So if the person that strings your racket actually strings it from the bottom up, it may change your sweet spot. So normally the standard is that your stringer would string from the top down, and your sweet spot will normally be more around that area. As mentioned, this is the optimal point in which you want to make contact with the ball in your squash racket. So that's what I mean by sweet spot. So the second type of racket that you have is what we would call the teardrop shape. This is the more modern and advanced type of racket which has been introduced into the squash game after many years of people only having traditional type rackets. And as you can see, compared to the previous squash racket that we had, which is a traditional shape, this has a longer main string which contributes to it having a larger sweet spot. Even though we do have a larger sweet spot, it does not mean that you do not have the same amount of control and power, but what it does mean is that it is more forgiving, and you've got a higher chance of actually placing and hitting the ball in the direction that you want to hit it in. There are other factors that can be spoken about if you want to obviously contribute to adding control to this type of racket, but this has been sort of the more modern type of racket, and you'll probably find a lot more club players using this type of racket, as I have mentioned, because it is a lot more forgiving when it comes to hitting the squash ball more consistently. The last racket that we need to speak about is called a hybrid racket. So I do not own any hybrid rackets. I have used hybrid rackets before, and what you'll find, the best way that I can do it is obviously put an image of some of the hybrid rackets that I know are in the market, so I'll put them up right here. But a hybrid racket is in the shape of a teardrop racket, but it has obviously a closed throat at the bottom. But yeah, a hybrid racket is the entire shape of the teardrop shape racket, but you would see that the throat will be closed somewhere around here. Hybrid rackets, you've seen them a lot with the Prince range of rackets that are currently on the market now. Carrick will have a few, as well as Dunlop. And I guess at the end of the day, what a hybrid racket does is that it gives you the best of both worlds between a traditional frame racket and a teardrop shaped racket. So that's the hybrid in detail. Not very common on the PSA from what I have watched. I have not seen many players use it. I do know one player which used to use a hybrid type racket, but not anymore. They're not as common, but if you are a person that actually uses a hybrid racket, please let us know why it is that you've chosen that racket. So with respect to racket shapes, that's about it. You get three types. If there are more on the market that I'm not aware of, please let me know. But those are the considerations that you need to make when it comes to squash rackets and racket shapes. Personally, I do like the traditional shape racket, and I played with it a lot when I was a junior. As the game has changed, obviously, from what it was up until what it is now, I found myself drifting towards the teardrop shape racket to give myself a better chance of hitting the ball in the direction that I want to and actually competing and staying competitive with these kind of guys. So that's about it for racket head shapes. Thanks for watching this episode in the mini-series about what you need to consider when choosing your next racket. If you have any comments, suggestions, or corrections that need to be made for the people in the community that are interested in picking out a new racket that would fare them best on the squash court, please put a comment down below and let's have a discussion about it. Take care. Cheers.